Episode 1. What a trust actually is, and what it is not. Hello, and thank you for joining this first session. My name's Alexander von der Phone, and I'll be your host. I spent more than 28 years working as a banker and a fiduciary. Over that time, I've advised more than 100 families and individuals from Polynesia to Japan, Canada to India, South Africa to the UK, as well as several hundred professional intermediaries and companies looking to increase their practical knowledge of trusts and their uses across multiple jurisdictions. For the last 20 years, my work has focused almost entirely on the architecture of trusts, the skill of trusteeship, and the challenges of long-term family governance. Alongside my advisory work, I'm a published author. I've completed a trilogy that reflects both the technical and the human dimensions of the private banking and fiduciary fields. In Trust, the Skill of Trusteeship, in 16 Success Stories and 1 Failure, I examined what exemplary trusteeship actually looks like in practice, drawn from real cases that I have been involved with across my career. In Stewardship, 14 Families and the Art of Lasting Wealth, I explored how successful families throughout history have preserved purpose, cohesion, and responsibility across generations and across geographies. And lastly, Banker, the Lost Art of Private Banking, looks at what has been lost over the past decades as private banking has become industrialized and regulated, and what still matters if outcomes are to improve. I'm going to be using specific real-life cases to illustrate concepts we look at. Not theory, not marketing, but what works, what fails, and why. My aim is simple: to give you a clear, practical understanding of trusts and trusteeship, grounded in reality and informed by experience. Before we begin, a brief but important note. This podcast is provided for your general information and discussion only. Please do not think that it is in any way legal, tax, fiduciary, or professional advice, and it should not be relied upon as such. Why? Trusts, family structures, and regulatory environments vary significantly by jurisdiction and personal circumstance. What is appropriate in one case may be wholly inappropriate in another. So nothing in this session should be interpreted as creating a professional relationship between us, and sadly, no responsibility can be accepted for actions taken or not taken on the basis of this material. I know that Clavis Partners AG will be happy to talk to you further about a professional relationship, but for the moment, this session is merely informative. As ever, you should always seek advice from appropriately qualified professionals in your relevant jurisdiction before making decisions or taking action. So why does this session matter? Well, this session is the first in a series, and it is actually the most important one. Not because it's technical, but because it clears the ground. Before we can talk sensibly about tax, governance, succession, protection, or planning, we need some sort of agreement on something more basic. What are we talking about? What is a trust, and what is it not? Because trusts sit at a kind of awkward intersection. They sit at an intersection between law and family life, between structure and emotion, and between long-term horizons and very, very human behavior. They're asked to do a great deal of work, and because of that, they have accumulated, well, mythology. Some of that mythology is accidental. Some of it is convenient, and much of it is actively misleading. So, today is about stripping that away. There's no selling, no optimization, no clever structuring, just, let's call it legal reality, and the consequences that flow from it. So, what should you achieve by listening to this session? Well, by the end of it, you should have a clean mental model about trusts. Not one that tells you what to do, but one that allows you to judge advice more clearly and to ask better questions. Because in my opinion, that's where real value sits. But before we go any further, there's one clear obstacle that we need to deal with. It's familiarity. Most of you listening to this session have encountered trusts before, or at least heard of them. Maybe you have friends who have settled one. Maybe you've read about them. Maybe you've read about them on the internet in the context of various leaks. You may have sat in meetings where trusts were discussed with confidence and fluency. In fact, some of you may even advise on them professionally. That experience may feel like a head start, but I'm afraid in practice, that's often the opposite. The most persistent trust failures I've seen did not arise because people lacked intelligence, education, or access to advice. They arose because everyone involved believed they already understood what was going on. The trust was familiar enough to feel safe, but not well understood enough to be handled correctly. So this is where false familiarity becomes dangerous. Different professionals carry different mental models of a trust. A lawyer may see a legal relationship defined by duties and remedies. A tax advisor may see a fiscal perimeter. A banker may see an asset holding structure. A family member may actually just see reassurance. A settlor maybe will see continuity, but with control intact. So none of these views is wholly wrong, but none of them on its own is complete either. The difficulty is that these partial understandings are actually rarely made explicit. People nod along, assuming alignment, when in fact they're talking past each other. The same word is being used to describe different things. The documents move forward, the structure is implemented, and the misunderstanding becomes embedded, not resolved. So that's exactly why trust problems often surface years later, at moments of stress, a death, a divorce, a tax inquiry, a disagreement about distributions. And at that point, everyone reaches for the same word, trust, and suddenly discovers that it no longer means the same thing to everyone in the room. So what feels like a sudden and shocking failure is actually the delayed consequence of an early misunderstanding. Familiarity also dulls curiosity. When something feels known, people just stop asking basic questions. They stop interrogating assumptions. They rely on precedent, on what's been done before, on what feels normal in their professional or family context. Sadly, trust law does not reward that comfort. It's unforgiving of assumptions. It's literal. It cares far less about what people thought they were creating than about what they actually created and how they behaved afterwards. So that's why I want to be clear about the purpose of this session. It's not to add another layer of information on top of what you already know. It's to strip back accumulated interpretation and bring you back to first principles. Not because first principles are simple, but because they are decisive. So, if you find yourself thinking, oh, I already know this, that's usually the moment to slow right down. Not because the material is new, but because the consequences of misunderstanding it are so often underestimated. Everything we will discuss in later sessions depends on this foundation. Tax planning, asset protection, governance, succession, all of these rely in some way or another on an accurate understanding of what a trust actually is, not in theory, but in operation. This is also why I will occasionally say things that sound uncomfortable or overly blunt, because trusts are so often wrapped in reassuring language. They are discussed politely, their tensions are softened. That doesn't help when reality intervenes. So, if parts of this session feel basic, please resist the urge to skim mentally. Basics in trust law are not background noise. They're load-bearing. So once we clear this ground properly, everything that follows becomes easier to judge. Advice becomes easier to test. Structures become easier to evaluate. And, importantly, you will become better equipped to recognize when a trust is being asked to do something that it simply can't do. So that clarity is the real objective here. Most trust problems that I have encountered did not arise because families lacked intelligence or advice. They arose because everyone thought they were talking about the same thing when they were not. The word trust was being used, but different people were carrying different meanings. For some it meant safety, for others tax efficiency, for others still control with a softer name. But the law does not recognize any of these meanings, and that's why this session matters. Not because it gives you new information, but because it removes assumptions you may not even realize you're carrying. And until that happens, every later discussion in this series risks being built on sand. So, part 1. Let's call it Why Trusts Are So Often Misunderstood. Trusts are misunderstood for three main reasons. The first one is language. We use the word trust loosely in everyday life. We trust people, we trust institutions, we trust advisors. That emotional meaning leaks into the legal concept and it causes confusion. A legal trust is not about confidence, it's not about belief, it's not about moral character. It's about enforceable obligation. Okay, so that distinction sounds really dry, but it does matter enormously. The reason is that when things go wrong, emotional trust evaporates all too quickly. What remains is legal reality, and many families encounter that reality far too late. So let me try and put it another way. In everyday life, trust is discretionary. You can withdraw it, you can adjust it, you can forgive breaches if you want to. Legal trust is the opposite. It's rigid, it's enforceable, and it survives disappointment. This is why families often feel shocks when conflicts arise. They believe a trust has been broken. The law believes a duty, however, has been breached. And these are not the same thing. One is emotional, one is structural. And when these collide, families too often discover too late that they were relying on personal trust where only legal trust existed. And that discovery is rarely gentle. So what's the second reason? Marketing. Trusts have been sold for decades, centuries as solutions. Asset protection solutions, tax solutions, control solutions, family harmony solutions. But when something is sold as the solution, its nature disappears behind the promise. Language shifts from obligation to benefit, from responsibility to outcome, from discipline to reassurance. Families begin to think of trusts as things that do something for them. That framing is already a misunderstanding because a trust does not exist to serve the settlor or beneficiaries in the way a product does. It exists to impose structure and obligation. So what's the third reason? It's counterintuition. Trusts deliberately separate things that most people assume belong together: ownership and benefit, control and enjoyment, power and entitlement. And most of our lives is spent trying to align these things. Trust law does exactly the opposite on purpose. That separation isn't a flaw. It's the actual mechanism. But it's also what makes trust so hard to grasp and easy to misuse. So let's give you an example of how these misunderstandings play out in practice. Not a disaster, not litigation, just something very common. So an Irish family I knew settled a trust to hold a portfolio of investment assets and a minority stake in an operating company. Documentation was careful, trustees were competent, the advisors were reputable, nothing about the structure raised alarm bells. And for several years, everything went smoothly. The trustees approved investments, distributions were made regularly, family meetings were cordial, the settlor remained involved, but informally. He offered views, the trustees listened. Most of the time, they agreed. I mean, it kind of felt collaborative, sensible, mature. From the outside, it looks like a resounding success. The difficulty was that everyone involved was interpreting that smoothness differently. The settlor believed the trust existed to give effect to his intentions efficiently. The trustees believed that they were exercising discretion, albeit in a calm environment. The beneficiaries believed distributions reflected entitlement rather than judgment. And no one articulated these assumptions because, well, after all, there was no reason to. Nothing was broken. But then circumstances changed. The operating company needed capital. And at the same time, one beneficiary wanted an increased distribution for a personal project. The trust could not comfortably do both, and a decision had to be made. For the first time, the trustees said no. Not permanently, not unreasonably, just no. The reaction was immediate and revealing. The settlor felt blindsided. He believed the trust existed to support the family's priorities, and this was clearly one of them. The beneficiary felt unfairly treated. They had received distributions for years and couldn't see why this request was any different. The trustees, meanwhile, were rather surprised by the strength of the response. They believed that they were doing exactly what the trust required. No one had acted dishonestly, no one had breached duty, and yet trust, in the everyday sense of the word, evaporated almost overnight. You see, what went wrong wasn't the decision, it was the expectation. For years, the trust had been operating in calm conditions where discretion and alignment happened to coincide. Everyone mistook coincidence for design. The moment that alignment broke, the underlying misunderstandings surfaced. The family spoke in the language of loyalty and disappointment. The trustees responded in the language of duty and discretion. But you see, these languages do not translate easily. Of course, the trust survived, it continued to function, but something had changed. Decisions became defensive. Communication became narrowed. The trustees documented everything more carefully, and the family suddenly felt managed rather than supported. Looking back, the problem wasn't that the trust had failed. It was that it had never really been properly understood. The trust had been treated as a cooperative arrangement, when it was in fact an independent legal relationship. The years of smooth operation had not proved the structure more sound. They had merely postponed the moment when its true nature would assert itself. So this is why misunderstandings about trusts are so persistent. They don't announce themselves early, they sit quietly underneath success. They're reinforced by convenience. And when pressure finally arrives, as it always does, they feel like betrayal, even though nothing improper has occurred. This is why so many trust disputes begin with the words, "But that's not what we thought this was." You see, the law, of course, is totally indifferent to that sentence. So before we go further, just let us reset. So part 2, what a trust actually is in legal terms. So at its core, a trust is a legal relationship, not a company, not a bank account, not a wrapper, a relationship. It arises when one party, known as the settlor, transfers legal ownership of property to another party, known as the trustee, to own and administer for the benefit of others, the beneficiaries, or for a defined purpose. There you have it. That's it. That sentence contains the whole structure. Everything else is commentary. One of the earliest trusts I was asked to advise on actually never came into existence at all, although the deed was drafted, signed, and paid for, all because the settlor did not understand what a trust was. He was an experienced Swiss businessman. He'd used companies all his life and assumed a trust worked much the same way. Assets would be placed into the structure, trustees would administer them, and major decisions would still come back to him. So during one meeting, we discussed a proposed investment. I explained that once the trust was established, the decision would be for the trustees to take, exercising their own judgment. He smiled and said, well, yes, but they'll know what I want. I asked him what he thought would happen if the trustees disagreed. He answered without any hesitation, well, they wouldn't. And at that point, it became clear that in his mind, the trustees were not fiduciaries at all. They were proxies. So I explained that if trustees are obliged to follow instructions, there's no trust. There's only retained ownership with, administrative help. The legal title may move, but control has not. And without that separation, the law will treat the arrangement exactly as it is, a facade. The conversation ended quietly. He didn't argue, he simply said, well, then I'm not ready to do this. We never settled the trust, and that was the correct outcome. You see, this story matters because it shows what a trust is not. It's not a wrapper. It's not a parking place. It's not a way of keeping assets while pretending to give them away. A trust only comes into existence when the settlor accepts that trustees must be free to say no. Until then, there is paper, but no trust. So, for a trust to exist, 3 elements must be present. First, certainty as to identifiable property. Not vague wealth, not promises, not dreams, actual property. Second, certainty as to who is to benefit or what purpose is to be served. Third, a clear intention to create a trust. Now, when these 3 things are present, the law imposes a consequence many people underestimate. The trustee becomes the legal owner of the trust property in law, not symbolically, not administratively. That ownership is real. The trustee signs. The trustee appears on registers. The trustee's contracts. The trustee can be sued. And ownership comes with duties, strict duties, personal duties, enforceable duties. And this is the heart of the trust concept. So let's ground this in a simple scenario. A founder settles shares of a family business into trust. They still attend board meetings, they still influence strategy, they still expect dividends to flow as before, and on paper, ownership has changed. In behavior, nothing has. For years, this appears to work, then something changes, a divorce, a tax investigation, a creditor claim. And at that point, the question is no longer what the document says, it's what actually happened. Who acted as owner? Who made decisions? Who bore the risk? And that's where many trusts slowly but surely collapse. Not because they were illegal, but because the reality of behavior never matched the structure. That mismatch is a single most common fault line in trust planning. So part 3, legal ownership versus beneficial interest. Let's slow this down. In a trust, ownership is split. The trustee holds legal title, the beneficiary holds a beneficial interest. So, legal title is practical power. It allows the trustee to act in the world, to buy, to sell, to invest, to litigate. Beneficial interest is different. It's not possession, it's not control, and it's not a guarantee. It's the right to expect a certain conduct, to expect the trust to be administered correctly, to be considered when required, to receive distributions where appropriate. So that last word actually is really important, where appropriate. And that's where many disputes begin. Now, someone believes that because they're a beneficiary, well, something belongs to them. Legally, it does not. They own a claim on behavior, not a claim on property. This discomfort is not accidental. It's actually the trust doing its job. So I can best illustrate this using a case I was asked to consult on. A British woman in her 40s was a discretionary beneficiary of a long-established family trust. She'd grown up knowing the trust existed. It paid for her education and, in fact, the education of her children. It supported major life events. And over time, it made regular distributions. Not identical every year, but frequent enough to feel, well, reliable. She never saw the trust deed. She didn't need to. The trust worked. Now, when her circumstances changed, she approached the trustees with a request. It wasn't extravagant. It wasn't urgent. It was, in her mind, reasonable. She framed it as a continuation of what had always happened. And the trustees declined. They explained their reasons carefully, the trust's overall position, competing needs, long-term sustainability. Nothing in their explanation was improper. Nothing was personal. And for her, it was incomprehensible, and she called me for a second opinion. She wasn't angry at first. She was confused. She'd never been promised entitlement, but she certainly experienced consistency. And consistency over time feels indistinguishable from ownership. What unsettled her most, I think, was not the actual refusal. It was the sudden realization that she actually had no lever, no appeal, no right to insist. She could challenge the process, perhaps, but she couldn't challenge the outcome. She could ask whether the trustees had acted properly, but not whether they had acted kindly. And this is the moment many beneficiaries struggle with. They discover that beneficial interest is not a softer form of ownership. It's a different thing entirely. It carries expectation without control and hope without certainty. So from the trustees' perspective, actually nothing unusual had occurred. They had exercised discretion, they had considered relevant factors, and they had acted within their powers. But from the beneficiary's perspective, something fundamental had shifted. The trust had gone from being a source of support to being a source of insecurity. Now, this gap in perception is not a failure of empathy, it's a structural feature of trust. Beneficial interest is designed to protect assets from impulse, pressure, and dependency. That protection applies even when the pressure feels justified, even when the beneficiary feels deserving, and even when the outcome feels harsh. So, where families and beneficiaries are not prepared for this, the trust becomes emotionally difficult to live with, not because it's malfunctioning, but because it's functioning exactly as intended. So this is also why beneficiaries sometimes describe trusts as cold or remote. They're experiencing the absence of ownership, not the absence of care. Understanding this distinction early matters. It shapes expectations. It prevents personal disappointment from being misinterpreted as misconduct. And it allows beneficiaries to engage with trustees on the right terms. A trust does not promise fairness in the everyday sense of the word. It promises process, judgment, and restraint. Now, whether that feels like a benefit depends entirely on whether one understands what beneficial interest actually is. Because it's one of the most misunderstood ideas in private wealth. It sounds like ownership, it feels like ownership, but it behaves nothing like ownership. A beneficiary can be wealthy on paper and powerless in practice. Now, that's intentional. The trust is designed to protect the asset from the beneficiary as much as for them. That's kind of uncomfortable to say, but it's also true. Where families refuse to accept this, they tend to pressure trustees to behave as distributors rather than fiduciaries. And once that happens, discretion decays. And once discretion decays, protection simply disappears. So part 4, the trustee's role and obligations. Trustees are actually often misdescribed. They're not custodians, they're not agents, they're not nominees. They are fiduciaries. A fiduciary must act in the interests of others. Even where doing so conflicts with their own interests, the law takes this seriously. Trustees must act in accordance with the trustee, in good faith, for proper purposes, with due care and skill, without unauthorized benefit to themselves. They must exercise discretion genuinely. That means thinking, weighing, judging. They're not required to make beneficiaries happy. They're required to act properly. A trustee who pleases everyone while breaching duty is failing. A trustee who disappoints someone whilst acting correctly may actually be doing their job well. This distinction is uncomfortable, but it is so essential to understand. Trusteeship is, sadly, often accepted casually. Someone is flattered, they agree, they assume, well, common sense will suffice. It will not. Trusteeship is one of the few legal roles where you can act honorably, act carefully, act with good intentions, and still be personally liable. After all, the law doesn't reward effort. It rewards compliance with duty. And this is why professional trustees behave differently from private individuals, not because they care more, but because they know what is at stake. A trustee who doesn't understand this tends to learn the hard way. So at this point, it's worth pausing on something uncomfortable. Most trust problems do not arise because someone behaves badly. They arise because everyone behaves reasonably, but from different assumptions. The set law believes that they have acted responsibly by putting assets into a structure that would outlast them. They see the trust as an expression of care, something designed to reduce risk, not create it. The trustees believe that they're doing their job by exercising discretion carefully, documenting decisions, and avoiding unnecessary confrontation. They see restraint as prudence. The beneficiaries believe that they're acting in good faith by relying on a structure that has supported them consistently. They see continuity as reassurance. Now, each of these positions is defensible. Taken together, they are unstable, because what sits beneath them is a kind of quiet misalignment about what the trust is actually for. The sacral could believe that the trust exists to preserve outcomes. The trustees may believe it exists to preserve process. Beneficiaries may, on the other hand, believe that it exists to preserve support. And none of these beliefs is wholly wrong, but none of them is sufficient on its own. So this is why trust difficulties feel often disproportionate when they arise. A single decision triggers a chain reaction that seems out of scale. Emotions run high, language hardens, positions entrench. From the outside, it looks like a dispute about money, but actually it's a dispute about expectations. Trust law does not exist to guarantee outcomes. It exists to enforce obligation. It privileges structure over sentiment and consistency over reassurance. And that design choice is deliberate. It's actually what allows trust to survive time, distance, and changing circumstances. But it also means that a trust will, sooner or later, disappoint someone. Often the real first test of a trust comes not from a crisis, but from divergence. A moment where what one party wants no longer aligns with what the trust can properly do. And that moment reveals whether the trust has been understood or merely tolerated. Where understanding is shallow, Disappointment becomes personal. Trustees are accused of being obstructive, beneficiaries feel judged, settlors feel misinterpreted. Each party believes the other have changed, when in fact the structure is simply being asked to do what it was designed to do. So this is also why trusteeship is so often underestimated. Trustees sit at a kind of intersection, one of competing expectations, armed only with judgment, duty, and process. They're expected to absorb disappointment without retaliation and to enforce restraint without appearing hostile. Now, where trustees are not properly empowered, or where they have been treated historically as facilitators rather than decision makers, that task becomes almost impossible. Discretion weakens, boundaries blur, and the trust begins to function as a distribution mechanism rather than a fiduciary institution. And at that point, protection is already eroding, even if no one notices. Families sometimes respond by adding layers. They add more advisors, more meetings, more reporting. But complexity does not fix misunderstanding. In fact, it often entrenches it. The more effective response is earlier and simpler. Clarity. Clarity about what the trust can and cannot do, and the acceptance of the limits that flow from that. A trust is not designed to eliminate tension. It's designed to contain it, to slow it down, to force decisions to be made deliberately rather than impulsively. Now, that containment only works when everyone involved understands that the trust is not an extension of themselves. It's a separate legal relationship with its own logic and its own constraints. Where that's accepted, trusts can be remarkably robust. Where it's resisted, they become brittle. So one final observation before we move on. People often resist clarity about trusts because clarity feels constraining. It removes a kind of comforting ambiguity. It forces difficult conversations earlier than feels polite, and everyone wants to close the sale. It requires people to confront limits that they would rather postpone until after the signature. Ambiguity, by contrast, feels generous. It allows everyone to believe their interpretation is still viable. It preserves harmony, at least on the surface. But ambiguity in a trust is never neutral. It doesn't sit still. It accumulates. And when it eventually collapses, it does so unevenly. Those with power feel accused. Those without the power feel misled. And trustees find themselves blamed for enforcing rules that were never properly acknowledged. So this is why experienced trustees are more often direct than families expect. They have seen what happens when expectations are left adrift. They know that disappointment deferred is not disappointment avoided. It is actually disappointment amplified. A trust that is clearly understood, on the other hand, may feel restrictive. A trust that is misunderstood for years feels unjust when it finally asserts itself. That difference isn't technical. It's deeply psychological. So that brings us to the final part of the session, because many of the most damaging assumptions about trusts are not about what they are. They are about what people hope they might be. This is why we now need to be explicit about what a trust is not. Let's be direct. A trust is not a bank account with better language. Once assets are settled, they're no longer your money. A trust is not a guarantee. It doesn't guarantee tax outcomes. It doesn't guarantee protection. It doesn't guarantee harmony. A trust is not a way to keep control while pretending to give it up. If control was retained, the law notices. And when it does, the trust fails at precisely the wrong moment. It's not a substitute for governance, for poor trustees, vague drafting, unaddressed family dynamics. Any one of these defeats even the most elegant of structures. And finally, a trust is not simple. Anyone who says this is simplifying for convenience or trying to get the sale. So, given all of this, why do trusts endure? Well, because they solve a specific problem. They allow assets to be managed across time, across generations, across changing circumstances. They introduce friction deliberately because that friction slows decisions, creates distance between impulse and outcome, forces judgment. And in families of means, that distance is often invaluable but it only works when everyone understands what a trust is and accepts what it is not. So, everything we've covered today is foundational, not tactical, not strategic, foundational. If this foundation is weak, everything built on it will crack. Tax planning will fail. Governance will become theatre. Asset protection will unravel. Family harmony will be promised and then lost. So that's why I've spent so long on what may appear basic, and I make no apology for that. In trusts, basics are decisive. This session was deliberately not about advocacy. It was about accuracy. A trust is not a product, not a promise, not a trick. It's a legal relationship, one that redistributes ownership, responsibility, and power in a very practical way. Once that's understood, everything else becomes easier to judge. So in the next session, we will look at why families use trusts at all: control, protection, continuity, and more importantly, when they should not use them. Thank you for your attention. Until next time.